All right, I'm going to get started. And before doing so, I've been privileged, I have to say. Well, I'm sorry.
You're on here.
Yeah? Okay. I'm privileged. I'm very thankful to Shelley Hirschberg and Helen Scher, who are sponsoring this year that I'm giving in memory of their father, his 13th Yisker, his first thing Yartzeit, I'm sorry. That's in Kafchet Elul coming up. And this Binyamin ben Yisrael Zev, as well as his brother, their uncle, Tzvi Hirsch ben Yisrael Zev. And we thank them for the sponsorship, and we daven that their nishamot should go mala higher and higher, closer to Kisei HaKavod, and thank you. The shir that we have, and whether it's one or two shiurim, is one that almost has no beginning, and it has a beginning, but the ending I'm never too sure about, because it's an overview of Sefer Devarim. The book of Deuteronomy is indeed a unique one among the Sifrei Tanakh and the Sifrei Torah, the Chamisha Sifrei Torah. It is unique and it is different in a number of ways. And we'll start by just going through some simple differences. But at the beginning of the opening of the Sefer immediately tells you, well, it's a little different than the other books. And you'll see why. Of course, the beginning of the book, Eilahad Devarim, these are the words. Devarim, we are so used to use it's things. It doesn't things, it means words. That's why dibur does not mean things, it means speech, talking, right? And right in the very beginning, we're suddenly giving an introduction we don't have in any of the other books of the Torah. These are the words that Moshe spoke to Israel, okay? We don't start, in the beginning of Shemot, it says, and this is going to be the story of the Exodus. We don't say in the beginning of Vayikra, and now we're going to go through all of the laws of the Korbanot. Nor do we ask, nor do we begin Sefer B'Midbar with the words that, and now we're going to go through the next 38 years, but very quickly. We don't have introductions, and yet here we have an introduction. An introduction that's saying these words that you're going to read now in this book are words that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke and told Bnei Yisrael. It is the first time we have a complaint of a rabbi speaking for too long. You get a sermon that goes on and on for all of these, for the entire Sefer.
That's why you break it up.
That's Moshe Rabbeinu. Only who can stand there and do that. Not only are we told that it was Moshe who did this, and he was the only one who's speaking this, but also we're told when it was done, because we're given precisely when it was done. We find it in the beginning. Let's see if I have that here. You have that in the very opening, the first source. 1 second. Is that okay? Thank you. Doors closed. Okay, good. They're inside there now. In the eating part. So that's that side. So we had to close that door.
Welcome.
Okay. Let's go. As long as they don't shoot too loud, we're okay. Anyway, so and there it says, first of all, where he said these words. I was, of course, being facetious and a little not properly showing the cover to Moshe Rabbeinu, and I was kidding around, and I said he didn't speak it at one time. He spoke it in different times. Now, the simple answer, and we'll go through that again, why, is you have to remember, again, when. When, remember right away that the very end of Bamidbar, they are already standing on the banks of the Jordan. They had, as we learned and reviewed actually in the last few classes, they had just conquered Sichon and Og. The 2.5 tribes had basically settled their families in that area, and whether that's part of the promised land or not is what we spoke about in the last 2-3 weeks. But they're settled, and they're ready to cross the Jordan. They're ready to go from the eastern to the western part, to the bulk of what we call Eretz Canaan, that would be Eretz Yisrael. So it's at that moment, just as they're about to go in, that Moshe says, he gives these speeches. And it's clearly understandable. Moshe knows he's not going to be with them. He's warning them what would be and what they should be doing, and these are the mitzvot. We'll get to that in a second. And therefore, as you see in the first source, that these are the words that Moshe addressed to all of Israel on the other side of the Jordan. By the way, Ever HaYarden is the other side, but there are two sides to the boy. As I told you, Gedot La Yarden. There are two sides to a river. Am I supposed to see little thing that the other side of the Jordan? Seems that that's not the real side. That's what. But I don't think so, because that's English. Ever is used in both sides. Anyway, it was on the banks of the Jordan River. Here, in this case, it's on the eastern side of the Jordan, there, that he spoke to them, Be'ever HaYarden. So that's when he's there. But not only there, he also spoke these words, Bamidbar, while they were in and traveling through the desert, Ba'arava, in the Arava, Mol Suf, even as close as long ago as near Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, that should probably be in. Bein Paran uvein Tofel, between Paran and Tofel. Paran we know, Tofel we're not sure where that is. Vilavan, also in that place. V'chatzeirot, we know it. V'di Zahav. We don't know the precise areas or places of these places. Chazal say nice things. Di Zahav reminds us of the Egel HaZahav, meaning when they had the sin of the Egel Zahav. And Tofel, they say Taflu, they spoke Lashon Hara, reflecting maybe the sins they did. Moshe spoke to them after that. But a simple pshat that these are names of places that at this point we don't know. When you consider the fact that they're going through a midbar, and it's very important for us. What we think of, what we dream of in the 21st century, 20th century, this is what it must have looked like. We are really very, very far away from that, the truth. I love the story of my son, the older son that I have, Baruch Hashem, 120, his bar mitzvah in 1995 was the first time he's coming to Israel. So the plane came down and he was looking out the window and he looked and turned to my wife and he said, "Where are the tents?" But for him, Eretz Yisrael Abraham was in the tent. Come on, give me So, but that's what a child would think, and that even was what we would think when we were younger, because we're not aware of what's things change. We have an idea of what it should be, and when we go through the midbar, understand that when they stopped off, they didn't stop off and said, "This is a nice sandy place." Undoubtedly, these were certain oases where they stopped. Yes, they had to have Miriam's water to give the proper amount of water and so on and so forth, but they looked at these oases to stop there. They didn't just stop in the middle of nowhere. We know that, in fact, the Torah says, especially when they first got out of Egypt, that there are the Elim Shnai, how many water holes there were, how many trees were over here, so on and so forth. They had this. So they stopped at these places. It could very well be that these places were oases or not, whatever. That's where they stopped, and where some of the parts of these speeches or ongoing shiurim that Moshe Rabbeinu had given at these different places, which means it wasn't just done all completely at one time, but and this is very important, these were speeches that were given over the years. And then it says, by the way, Achar Asar Yom, so how long were these speeches? Well, wait a minute, I told you there are many of them. I am going to suggest, this, I might be wrong. Sometimes I'm wrong. I remember once I was wrong when I thought I made a mistake. Anyway, it goes on and it says, it is an 11 days journey from Chorev to Kadesh Barnea. Yeah. Chorev is another name of, what's Chorev? Har Chorev? Har Sinai. So in other words, that's when they started. When did they start their travel in the desert, really? They had waited about a year, almost 2 full years at Har Sinai. And it was about 23, was it 20? No, I'm sorry, 1 year at Har Sinai. They got there in Nisan and they left in Iyar. Then they got there, in the beginning of Sivan, and they left a week before the week before the beginning of Sivan the next year. Anyway, so that's when they started in earnest to travel through the desert towards what? Toward Eretz Yisrael, right? That was the promise. Immediately, Moshe reminds them, you know what it is? It really was a 11-day journey. In other words, it should have taken you what? 11 days. Chazal come and say, really, when you look through the words in the throughout the Torah, you see, you figure out how many times this and that. They traveled basically. Although it wasn't an 11-day journey, God saw to it that they could do it in 3 days. And the next verse says, so it was in the 40th year. What do you think, Moshe? The Torah is telling you. Mishiganis, you could have done this whole thing in 11 days. Why does it take 39 more years, 40 years? Answer? You blew it. Your sins is the only thing that caused you to have to schlep along here in the desert. And although it doesn't say it with words, Chazal are very sensitive to this, and I think very well, pointing out a very important thing, that whether Moshe would say it or not, he's saying, and here we are in the 40th year. And it's a new generation. And by the way, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's very important. It helps us understand, as we start to review a lot of the mitzvot that were given earlier, well, why? Answer, they weren't in the classroom. They weren't there when many of the mitzvot may have been given. Now, I'm going to try and tell you later on, so please forget this, so that when I say it later on, you'll say, oh, that's a good idea. That these laws were given constantly. Moshe didn't give them once, and then waited, and then a year and a half later gave a different law, and so on and so forth. He taught these laws, but he didn't teach them once. He understood they had to be explained and repeated. So the new children who grew up were then educated and found out these things. So it wasn't that they were completely aware of any of these mitzvot, and suddenly Moshe gave them a month, a little more than a month to, Moshe dies at Zayin Adar, according to Chazal. It isn't specific in the Tanakh, The assumption that he had died in the 7th of Adar is based upon the fact that Israel, we know from the text in Yoshua, that Israel crosses the Jordan on the 10th day of Nisan. And it says before they cross, God tells them, prepare for 3 days. And it says after the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, God said, prepare for 3 days. Well, fortunately, God had his fingers. He was able to count 10 minus 3, 7. So we figured that from Yud, to 33 days before the 10th of Nisan was the 7th of Adar. So that's how Chazal understand that, is it, oh yeah, that's what it has to be? Not really, because we don't know when it was. And when it says that after the death of Moshe, it doesn't mean right then that he said it, after the 30 days. We don't know. But anyway, he does die in the 40th year in the desert. That we know for sure. And after his brother Aharon had died in Av, and this is, later. But at any rate, it wasn't just these days that Moshe says, "Oop, I forgot to tell you, I got 613 things I got to tell you about," and start going through all the mitzvot. This has been taught and educated throughout their shall I say, time in the desert. When one thinks about it, we begin to realize that perhaps the punishment, and I should put it in print, but it was a punishment to the sin of the spies, was a necessary classroom. It was an understanding that one could not expect a slave nation to learn all of these laws, and within 2 weeks they can go in and they'll do it all. He understood the attitude and the understanding background of these people. And there was a necessity to teach them and to train them and to educate them, and especially to educate the new generation. So that happens. These speeches that Moshe Rabbeinu gives, I would submit to you, was things that were given over time, and they are more than, as we will see, simple. You have to know these mitzvot. It is rather a lot of warning that, in effect, says, I know you're Jewish, and I know, you're stubborn people, Even though Moshe was not, probably didn't have a driver's license to get into to drive here in Yerushalayim, we know that people are somewhat stubborn, and I was telling somebody as I was driving today, so they cut it right in front of you, and they have in most places when you signal that you're going to go into another lane, that means I'm hoping everything's clean, and I'm gonna look behind you and I can go and be aware I'm going to go in. And in Israel, it is, here I come. I got my blinker on. I can do what I want to do. So it gets difficulty when you're driving. So Moshe Rabbeinu knew that the Bnei Israel were, and he said, Am Kasheyorov. God said it. You're a stubborn nation. God wanted that. If we weren't a stubborn nation, we wouldn't be around now. It's a bracha within the klala. It really is. So he knew they were. And he knew it's going to take some time of education and to warn them. You know what I've taught you all of this time? You've got to be very careful. You're going to be tempted not to follow. You're going to be tempted by the foreigners who are there, which is why your job, once you get in there and you defeat the strong alliances that will stand before you in war, once you get then inside, I once mentioned it's like the National Guard in the United States. You're gonna, each shevet has its own more little military, and your job is to either have these pagans, these idolaters, stop their idolatry. You didn't have to become Jewish. They had to just stop idolatry and accept certain mitzvot, so that they do not really. But looking for corrupt, I suppose, the community. That's what they had to do. The Israelites had a better idea. The bulk of the tribe says, we don't have to do that. And as I pointed out to you more than once, That's the story of the Tanakh. Tanakh should have stopped after Yehoshua with a simple ending that says, and the Shvatim did as God told them and removed all of the idolatry and pagan. They didn't do that. And everything afterwards, all the sins we read about in Shoftim, the difficulties of getting a leader, and the times that they've been attacked from within and from foreigners from without, constantly being things. It was a tough time. The Sefer Shoftim, which I love to teach because it's so not known. It's not well known. We'll be getting to that. Don't worry. Please God should allow us. After we finish Devarim, we'll go to Yoshua, we'll go to Shoftim. Fascinating stories that nobody knows about. And it's a wonderful, it's a terrible thing not to know it, because you get to understand what was going on, what was the culture at the time, what was happening at that century, and what struggles they were facing. So that Shoftim, and then the difficulty of finding a king. What was the king's purpose for? Why did they want the king the first time? In order to have someone who would fight their wars. Why? Because they were getting wars. Why? Because they didn't chase away with the people they were supposed to. Just like God said was going to happen to them. And God knew this. He must have read it somewhere. He knew this was going to happen. It's unbelievable. And everything, and that's Shmuel and Melachim was horrible what happened in Melachim Bet, to the Churban HaBayit, and then even before Churban HaBayit and the destruction of the temple, you have all of the books of Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, and believe me, it wasn't recipes for a good honey cake. Those are the prophets telling them, you're going to be punished, you're doing the wrong thing, you better change. And also, so you don't get completely depressed, I'll tell you how good it's going to be if you listen to him, if you go new tshuva. That's what all of these Nevi'im are saying, both those three and the TORAH are. But basically, that's what was happening. Why? Again, because they didn't finish Sefer Yehoshua the way it should have been finished, as it goes on. And as I've mentioned, it's no coincidence that the Samaritans only consider the first 6 books of the Tanakh as the important ones, not the other ones, and the Muslims as well. Islam sees the first 6 books. They believe in Moses. So they have that. And that was a challenge that Moshe had to face when he's preparing this new generation, relatively new. I mean, some of them may have been born after slavery, or at least when they were babies when there was slavery. And as long as they were less than 20 years old when the sin of the spies took place, they were still going to go in. So you're going to have 59, 60-year-old men who will be going into the land. So, but it was a new generation, and they didn't have that, shall we say, that culture, that slavery culture and mindset. And he had to speak to them that. So he had to tell them. So now this is these few words, we're getting more understanding why. This is what Moshe said, and he's been speaking these things in more than one place, in all these different places, and he did it at the very end, but the 40th year, meaning they're about to get into the land, and he's warning them, and even Acharei Hakoto, as it goes on, after they had defeated Sichon and Og and took over the area. In other words, so the beginning of, what should we say, Atchalta de Geula. It's the beginning of the redemption. The concept that we were redeemed in Egypt was mostly true, but not completely true. Because the final part of that is Veheveti etchem el haaretz. The promise was not only the 4 cups of wine at the Seder, it's only the Vilakachti and then Veheveti. You have also getting into the land was the final part of the Geula. So therefore, that is the mention of Acharei Hakoto was almost something. You see, you can do it, and God's keeping His promise. You did take over the land, as He said. Okay, so that's what we find here. It's also a different Sefer Devarim, and in that when Moshe comes and says, "Oh, remember, these mitzvot." They aren't exactly the same that we read the first time the mitzvahs. First of all, and this I have said before, I don't think I've said to this class. Understand what the Greeks call a Deuteronomy, right? Deutero means two, Rana means law. Why do they say that? Because the Chazal called it Mishneh Torah, which meant a repetition of it. And it isn't a repetition. It isn't a repetition of the Torah, at least not of the written Torah. That's very important to know. I've once told you, I may have said it once when you were here, and maybe somebody remembered. I usually don't, but if you would see Devarim as, it's repeating the Torah. Good. There are 5 books of Torah. Well, Devarim is one of them. Well, let's go to the first 4 books. Is there anything about the stories of Bereshit found in the Sefer Devarim? Answer is no. Is there anything about Sefer Shemot that's in Devarim? Yes, there are some stories there. Oh, we hear about the slavery of it. Oh, no, we don't. Oh, we see about Moshe. Oh, no, we don't do that. Oh, we see about all the plagues. Oh, the plagues aren't there in Devarim either. The first thing we read in Devarim that had anything to do with Sefer Shemot was probably Kriyat Yamsuf. Oh, no, that's not there either. It's Har Sinai. First thing. Har Sinai and the giving of judges also, which Yitro does. After that, we do in Mishpatim have mitzvot, and some of them are found in Devarim. But the last half of Sefer Shemot is all about the building of the Mishkan and what you do inside there. Not one thing of that is found in the Torah. We have, yes, the story of the Egel HaZahav. That is also from Shemot. But except for Egel HaZahav and the Har Sinai and some of the mitzvot and Mishpatim, none of the rest of Shemot is mentioned. It's not a repetition of Shemot. So it must be Vayikra, it's by repeating. There's basically not one law of the Korbanot and anything that we learn about in Vayikra that you find in Devarim. Yeah, they do have a mention of the Chagim. You have that Re'eh as you have there. And so you have that. And 1 or 2 mitzvot. That's it. So we're left with maybe it repeats the stuff in Bamidbar, so without going into more detail, no, it doesn't. So the idea, the concept that, Devarim is just repeating the Torah is simply not true. Please understand that. So what does it mean, a repetition, a Deuteronomy, a Mishneh Torah? And this is where it comes crucial to understanding, and I mentioned this, and I learned it as well. It was a repetition of the Torah, the laws that Moshe had been teaching them throughout the 40 years in the desert. He may not have written them all down, or at least not record them in the Torah, written Torah, but that's the Torah that they had been learning from the time that he received the Torah. This new generation was, as I told you before, going to be educated. They were educated throughout the time in the Midbar, and Moshe taught them that only the laws, but at time he gave them warnings and reminded them about mitzvot, and that's where it says over here. These are the places where he did these bigger and longer speeches. So that's important to know. It's also important to realize that Moshe is talking here. God is not. This is Torah Moshe. I know it's so. He's quoting what God said, but we'll find, and we'll get into it, stories that he tells that's not like the stories that were told in the Torah. I think I pointed it out last week. He talks about Sichon No, never talks about that whole back and forth with the 2.5 tribes trying to say, can we have this land, and so on and so forth, and everything. Doesn't mention it at all, like it's not there. When we get to the Aser HaDibrot, we're going to say a little different, a little less dramatic than what we read in the Shmot. It's important to understand Moshe has a target. He has an idea of what he wants to leave to people. That all the details weren't that important for him. And when he tells it, sometimes he'll skip certain things and he will really emphasize other things because they're going to be an important lesson to teach them for the future. And we'll go through many of these differences, even some mitzvot that are different. Let me think of one. We have a mitzvah, right, of that were given seemingly to everyone, and then in the Devarim, it's just the Kohanim want to do that. Well, again, I get to that. So things that were not given. Why something else? What did we learn? We learned about Yibum in the Parshat. We just did it actually now, if I'm right. In Devarim. But before Devarim, the concept of Yibum, of taking over a widowed woman who may not have children and then should be supported, is found to be in the stories of us. I remember I started this with Abraham taking on Sarai, right? And Yehuda and Tamar. And things like that. So this was a seemingly about what one of my teachers said was really a minhag, or I say minhag, or Torah Havot. There was there was nothing, and then there was Torah. There were customs and proper laws that were done, Hittite laws sometimes, other laws that were adopted by the Hebrews and became, sometimes with little tweaks, laws. And sometimes most of them were ignored. But you have that. You have to understand this and see this doesn't just go on and, it's not just a cartoon. These are stories of a historical story of a nation that goes through this. So when Moshe goes and sees the stories and mentions them in Devarim, we're going to find, among the other unique things about Devarim, that it ain't exactly the same way, and they're reading for it. Of course, because of the fact here that the bulk of Devarim, at least till the last parsha we had, Ki Tavo, you never find the famous stories about Yomer Hashem el Moshe Lemor, or Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor. You never see, and God spoke to Moshe. No, he didn't. Moshe was speaking to the people. Nothing about that. Chazal go to the point, they claim that since this is on the 40th year, it's actually the first time that God finally spoke to Moshe again since the sin of the sin of the Meraglim. And for that whole last 38 years, God was so angry, he would not communicate directly with Moshe. That's what Chazal see, and they see it in the fact that the first time we see Vayidaber Hashem, Vayom Hashem is here in Devarim. Now, how essential that is, let's face it. We don't know when the story of Korah happened and God did speak then. We don't know. That was after the Meraglim. So they say that, if according to those, it was right after, it's fine. But we don't know for sure. We don't know when it happened with Korah. You know what God spoke to with Korah. And then even Ezra says it happened months after, So we're not sure, but that's Chazal based themselves on that idea. I think the idea is not so much to be literal as much as to be understanding that how God's disappointment was to the point where then he wouldn't even talk to Moshe. Not that Moshe was disappointing him, but the people were, and Moshe stood for the people. That was an interesting thing, so we don't see that either. And there are sometimes, linguistically, there are different stories, for example, differences in words. I know some not necessarily traditional commentaries like to look to the reading of the and words of the Torah of the Devarim, claiming that this had been written much later on. And one of the more, not Jewish, but one of the traditional ones said, have you ever seen the writings of, who was it? Poem. Oh, come on. He used to have a brain. Someone a poet, well known, who also wrote the history of Rome. Did you ever see you ever compare the two? It's different. Why? Same thing here. It wasn't that it's a different time or era, but a different purpose of the book. Anyway, what's very interesting, as I pointed out, and is the differences in the Aseret HaDibra. And why that it is. I think I had done that before, but I will repeat it again. Why the story of what happened at Har Sinai is told by Moshe differently than what we see in Shemot. And also to understand, finally, let's face it, what's Moshe's concern? I'm not going to be here. What am I going to tell you? Imagine this as a final will, but with this time the father and the children in front of him. And he's telling them, you got to be careful about this, A, B, C, D. And that's what Moshe had to do. That's why he reminded, and throughout Devarim, he will remind the people of how they sinned and the result of the sins, and the punishment they might get, so that they'll be careful when it goes on. Now, I had a wonderful balabas of mine when I was in Fort Lee, who used to come over to me always at the end of Devarim, because and it says, I think it's the end of this week's Pasha. Ki yadati, he says, I what Moshe says to Israel, I know that you're going to sin and you're going to be raped and it's going to happen, you're going to exile. And he said to me, why does Moshe do that to Israel? They can't help but to sin now if he's telling them, well, you're going to sin. It was a good question. I had to come up with some answer that I hope was good enough. I don't remember the answer, but I remember the question. That's really true. It's very difficult. And so, but because he knew that was going to happen, he wanted to give them enough warning. Who knows? Perhaps it would have happened earlier were it not for these warnings. Who knows? But anyway, he does that. And the big problem is, and the big challenge is, you're going into a land that's going to be filled with idolatry. It's a lot easier to make friends with the idolaters and not have to fight and risk your lives in a war. And just, we'll be fine. We'll open up kosher pizza stores, and hopefully they won't put swastikas on the windows. No, there's nothing to. It's easier. So Moshe, in this Sefer Devarim, explains the challenge they're going to have living among idolaters and a corrupt culture. This is the culture, remember, that would sacrifice their children. That's so. That's something that he's warning them about. And of course, he does repeat the mitzvah, as I said. So that is an overview of an introduction of Devarim. But we will begin, and I'll see if if it's time for me to give this out also. Well, Maybe I'll see in a second. Depends how long I'm going to talk. Yeah, about another 10 minutes maybe. Yeah, a little less. Okay, fine. The first part, after the introduction, this was just the introduction. And that's what it is. The first 5, 6 psukim, right? Then 4 psukim. And then Moshe begins with a history. That's why I have here in the second thing the historical background. After the Torah, whoever it was, who wrote the introduction that was written, that this is when it happened, this is where it happened. Okay. Now, Moshe talks to the people, and he says, Hashem, our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you stayed long enough at this mountain. I told you, this is when they begin to now make their journey to Eretz Israel. Hopefully, Achad Asar Yom, it was an 11-day journey, maybe a little longer because of the cattle and the animals, whatever, and all the children, whatever. It was a journey of 11 days. They left at Har Sinai to make their way to the land of Israel. How does God tell them? God says clearly, Pinu usu'u lachem, I want you to go, and toward Har Moriah, the hill country, in other words, from where you are, to go towards the land of Israel, right? Because I'm giving you that land that I promised to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So, okay, make your way, let's go. Okay, get started. And just as we think, and what we expect, and so the people have gone up and they started marching through and they got sand between their toes and they went their way. And that's not what happens. Because after we've gone through these, the psukim, these are the verses 6 to 8, that God says, okay, go, all of a sudden it stops. Because in the 9th verse, pasuk tet, instead of telling me that, and they moved from here to there, and they went as God had told them, and so on and so forth, it says, V'omar alechem, right? I'm sorry. He says, at that moment, Moshe said, I told you before we started moving, he said, we can't go on. I can't handle you anymore by myself. When does Moshe have a difficulty judging the people and leading the people? When did that happen? Did that happen in the Torah at all? At Yitro, very good, right? He was sitting there, Miboker Arav, it says there, a whole time he was sitting there trying to judge them, and his father-in-law went over to him and said, just can't go on. It's not real, Yitro was a head and a leader of a people. Moshe was just starting his job. He says, you can't do this, you can't do it by yourself. And he ended up setting up a judicial system. So you have more judges. Is there any other time that Moshe complains about this?
Yes, many times.
About not being able to lead?
Like when they complain about the water.
Well, yeah, but you're right. You're right. I said that. But when did he say, I can't do this anymore? Huh? He fell to his face there. But he never said, God, he said, kill me. He said, in Perek Yud Aleph of Bamidbar, and the end of Parshat Beha Alotachan, there we read of the Mitzonanim, and the people complained there, and at that point, Moshe says, I can't do this myself. He said, if this is what's going to happen to me, to continue to drive these difficult people, kill me. That's it. That's different than what he said, Har Sinai.
Which point is that?
They traveled from Har Sinai, and they started to complain about everything. What's called the mitzvah onanim, and then the kivrot hatava. Right, it's all parak. It's a great parak too, and they can make a movie out of that one. They complain everywhere. It's terrible. And Moshe says, I can't do it anymore. I'm only one person, and God says, I'll choose shiv'im zakenim. I'll choose 70 elders, meaning leaders. So in effect, we have twice where Moshe couldn't do the leadership. Once as judge, and then as a singular leader. And God answers it by setting up a judicial system, and also by choosing 70 leaders. Here we find, as we'll show you, Moshe is mentioning one of them. But in that one, he basically includes both times. He includes here, this is on the third, at the bottom of the first page. That's a third source. And if you want to turn over and get the rest of the source and the English, you'll see what happens there. And though we won't finish it now, you'll see what I mean. It says, first he says, Lo uchal, I can't do this myself. He didn't say that with Yitro. It was Yitro who said to him, you can't do this. But he only said himself, I can't lead anymore. That's in B'halotcha. And he says that, likewise, the idea of choosing leaders from each tribe is also from B'halotcha. That's not what happened with the judges. So it says, and you will agree with me, and therefore I did, Anashim Chachamim, very wise men, and make them the leaders. And then it says, Va'atzaveh et shoftechem ba'et hahi. And then I told the judges how they're supposed to judge the people. Well, wait a minute. There were no judges over there. When did he tell about the judges? That was the story of Yitro. So he pushes both in, And I told you everything you should do. Exactly these words, when he tells them that you don't be afraid of anybody as a judge. It's God's just judgment. Anything too difficult, bring to me. That's what he tells in Yitro. So there are two things here going on. So he puts them both together in a brilliant way of basically saying a simple thing. Even before you left, we had a judicial system. We had a legislative system. You had everything you needed. And that's crucial before the next part. And we'll get to that next time. I wish you not only a Shabbat Shalom, but please God will have a Shana Tova. God should say, enough. Huh? You're not going to use it. I'm going to use it later on, so you might as well bring it back. You can keep it. You plan to come back. Good. So, Mir Hashem, Shana Tova.